And joining us now to discuss this week's developments surrounding the charges against former Free State Premier and ANC Secretary General Ace Magashule is political analyst Sanusha Naidu from the Institute for Global Dialogue. Sanusha, good evening. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Today was certainly significant.
Good evening, Bongiwe. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just listening to your insert, I mean, you can actually see how palpable the issues are, the tension is, and even the words. The words are not necessarily one that's saying, you know, we're still going to find common ground. This is basically saying it's an all-out aggression. I particularly found Mr. Magashule's point about they're not going to get rid of us. So he's not saying get rid of me, but he's talking about a collective here. And that language, I think, is very important as well, because it suggests that these divisions are so intense and that they are so acute and chronic within the party that it's going to be difficult to unseat him. I mean, we see, the other thing, you know, not to be completely facetious, but I think whenever they need to bring out the white guy and to defend them, they bring they bring him out, and it's amazing how we've come to this point. And just reading the actual state case in terms of what is being put forward in front of the court and what is the issues with regard to the questions around what was the 21 levels of criminality or allegations of crime that Mr. Magashule had committed. I mean, part of it is the PFMA and the disregard of the PFMA. So I think what we're dealing with here is this is a big one, and certainly one that is going to take this ANC much more than what we've been seeing in the past. And of course, concurrently, we can't ignore the Jacob Zuma saga.
And when you talk about the PFMA, some have suggested outside court that these charges are flimsy. You can't say that he did not exercise oversight. This is just, you know, something that is a political machinery. But certainly, it's a serious charge to not have exercised oversight, particularly when you look at what we also heard from the State Capture Commission, Sanusha, where Mosebenzi Zwane was telling us that he did not know that there was even a Housing Act when he was MEC.
That, for me, tells me how did you then become appointed if you didn't familiarize yourself with these legal documents, these documents that are supposed to hold accountability, morality, ethics, and most importantly, sections of the Constitution. Now, I haven't read the full state's case. I mean, it's quite legal in its nature, but I think just from looking at it from an aerial perspective, there are sections of the Constitution that have been violated. And you were Premier of the Free State at the time, and in his address, Mr. Magashule, according to the state's case, had made statements in that State of the Province address that asbestos roofing would be discontinued or done away with within the period of about 2014 and thereafter. And it's quite sad that you can actually claim that you didn't know that I mean, people can say that these documents, the Constitution that governs us, both in transparency, accountability, and morality, you didn't know that these issues existed. I mean, how do you actually then define yourself in terms of going forward? I mean, to get a position in government, I think these days it becomes almost a non-starter that you can actually go into government and claim, I didn't know that these documents existed. And I think that's really an indictment of understanding what the processes are in terms of these documents. And of course, what is seriously concerning for me is how that information gets misinterpreted and filtered down the ranks in terms of how the supporters outside or people who claim that these documents or these regulations and frameworks are flimsy.
And when you look at today, Sanusha, it was totally, reminiscent of some of the scenes that we have been seeing in recent years. And also when you go back in time to 2005, the trial of Jacob Zuma, you then go to the corruption case, you go to his appearances at the State Capture Commission. I mean, I can just name these just a few events that we have been seeing. Today was certainly yet another day that was reminiscent of what we have been seeing. And certainly as he spoke, there were no holds barred. As he said that you are not going to get rid of us, and certainly we are not going anywhere. And this was also a message that was even shared by some of those that were outside court that were in his support. It's not a surprise that we're finding ourselves in this point, particularly with such a divided ANC.
Absolutely. I mean, you've basically made me reflect and go back to 2005, and I think that has been the precedent that we will actually have two processes of a legal challenge here. The one that happens within the framework of the judiciary, and the one that happens outside of the court. And if my memory serves me correctly, I think the judge or the magistrate, and I stand corrected in the name, who was presiding over the bail hearing today, actually commented on this in his statement around the bail hearing, and of course the actual bail itself. So I think what is important here is the issue that the optics that we are seeing is very, very disconcerting, because you're now beginning to see those optics that kind of found its traction in 2005 becoming much more intense in 2020. And of course, whatever happens out in terms of the judicial process, I think we can't ignore whether or not this will be accepted going forward. Now, it's basically what Mr. Magashule has done is that he's got one tick for himself in terms of saying, I'm going nowhere. You've got the Deputy Secretary General issuing a statement saying, you know what, the ANC, telling the top leadership the ANC is in crisis. And she's right. But I mean, it's not new, that this is not news to us. We know that the ANC is in crisis. And of course, trying to say that if you are going to go out there in the name of the ANC and the ANC regalia, etc., there are certain conditions or certain issues that you have to abide by. I find this all very, very puzzling and bemusing at times, because we know that this is a big fight in the ANC about power struggles, fragmentation, and who gets control within the space.
And talking about the party's decision on corruption, you look at, the 54th National Conference resolution, particularly this one that talks about reaffirming the 2015 NGC resolution that ANC leaders and members who are alleged to be involved in corrupt activities should, where necessary, step aside until their names are cleared. And it says, should, where necessary, step aside. Is that necessary at this stage?
Well, if you think about implementing it and taking it at face value, then obviously that's the litmus test. Who steps aside is the bigger question for me. Is it easier for the foot soldiers to step aside because they are much more negligible in this fight against corruption? But once this corruption fight starts getting into the real big spaces and the issue of real big names and the big personalities and the big man politics, then they're not stepping aside.
Sanusha, I tell you, I just feel like you and I are going to be talking about quite a lot, of this particular installment going forward. And certainly, as you say, who should step aside? Because this does certainly look like it's going to open quite a can of worms. And looking at what, Ace Magashule had to say himself outside court, that he's going to spill dirt on his own detractors, he's not going to keep quiet. Certainly, it does look like there is going to be quite a lot that is said going forward. And thank you so much for your time tonight. That's political analyst Sanusha Naidu.